Okay. Welcome, everyone. So glad that you've chosen to join us today on this Friday. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I use she, her pronouns. I serve as the Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And I'm so excited to kick us off for our event today, which is a joint meeting of our policy practice group and our Network of Networks group. And we are so grateful to have the opportunity to be in conversation with Victoria Salinas, Associate Administrator for Resilience at FEMA. Recognizing that this may be the first ASAP event for some folks, I'm going to just quickly run through who we are. American Society of Adaptation Professionals. We are a hybrid professional association and social impact network for adaptation professionals, practitioners, students, scholars, applied researchers. We have about 1,000 individual members and 45 organizational members. And our members come from all different sectors, as you can see here on the screen, and that sectoral and regional diversity is really where the strength of our network lies. And together with our members and partners, we're working to advance the field of climate change adaptation by learning from Western science, Indigenous knowledge, and the lived experience of people addressing climate impacts in their communities. We're also really privileged to have 45 organizational members, as I mentioned, an incredible group, including federal agencies, cities, engineering and planning firms, community organizations. They provide invaluable support to the ASAP network, advance the adaptation field, and receive support from the network to advance their adaptation and resilience goals. And I think Eliza is going to make sure we're all on mute, but you can help us by making sure you're on mute. Here at ASAP, we have programs that are designed to build the capacity of our members to do effective adaptation work and work together to strengthen the field. And so they include the three areas that you see on the screen: network support and peer learning. And that's why we're here today. We also do a lot of technical assistance and capacity building, as well as education and workforce development. And again, we're so excited to be hosting this joint session of our policy practice and Network of Networks peer learning groups. And so in a second, I'm going to turn things over to Melissa Ocaña, one of our Network of Networks group leaders. But before I do that, I want to invite everyone to introduce yourself in the chat. We're a big group today, so we won't be able to hear from every single person, although at the very end, we will go into some networking breakouts. But for now, please let us know who you are, where you're calling in from, and if you are part of the policy practice or Network of Networks group, we'd love to know that as well. And now let me turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Rachel. Just a brief introduction of the Network of Networks group. I'm Melissa Ocaña. As Rachel said, I'm the Climate Adaptation Coordinator at UMass Amherst, she, her pronouns. And our group is here to foster a supportive community for those who are organizing adaptation networks across the country. We promote peer learning of network-related lessons, professional development, and offer opportunities for collaboration. We're also trying to increase visibility among the networks, including the networks of networks. And originally we were an ASAP member-led group, and now we're an ASAP affiliated peer learning group, which means our membership is open. If these are things that are of interest to you, I hope you'll join our group. We meet monthly, just like the policy practice group, normally on different days, however. And we'll put the join links into the chat for both of these groups. And I'm going to hand it over to Anna.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm really excited to bring the groups together today and to just introduce the PPG group briefly for those of you who might not be familiar. So the policy practice group is one of the member-led interest groups for ASAP for the past couple of years and this year as well. And we focus on a number of different areas, but this year we've been particularly excited to hear from many different leaders at federal agencies about implementing adaptation policy and also learning about how ASAP can feed back into federal processes that are developing and putting out these policies. So excited to continue doing that today. We've also sprinkled into our year hearing about implementation of adaptation policy at the state and regional level. And that is something we'll continue doing next month when we hear about sort of the mid-Atlantic and southern part of the country work happening in Virginia and North Carolina. So we also kind of work towards the policy objectives that the groups developed over the years. And I think those are on the next slide. Yeah, the policy priorities. And so would love to stay connected with everybody who's interested in kind of helping us to forward these. And then I also just wanted to mention, as we jump into today, that we see a lot of connections between the network of network groups and the policy practice group. And of course, networks can be a really key pathway to well-informed policy and drawing on the collective knowledge of networks and collaboratives. And we've heard about that a lot throughout the meetings that we've had this year. And then, as Rachel mentioned, ASAP itself is, a social impact network. And I think we all see the value of practitioners working, especially those of us working in the policy space, and benefiting from being a part of networks and collaboratives. So it's exciting to kind of be together today and dig into that a little bit more. We're gonna jump right into introducing Victoria, but before I do, the person behind the scenes today who has made this all happen is Shannon, and just want to give a huge shout out to her for making it possible for Victoria to join us, and she's been a key leader in the policy practice group this year, and really, really appreciate the awesome work that she's been doing. She also leads a lot of our efforts to respond to requests for information from various federal agencies. And so that is not an easy job, kind of bringing us all together and putting that information into one place. So I appreciate all her work. So with that, I think we're going to jump right into introducing Victoria. And her full bio is in the agenda that we've shared the link around for, but I will introduce her with an abbreviated version since there's so much. But Victoria, thanks so much for joining us. Victoria is the lead for resilience at FEMA. She's focused on accelerating all hazards resilience in the nation's most underserved communities. Most recently, before this role, Victoria served as the Vice President for Programs and Communications at the nonprofit Fuse Corp. She partnered with leaders from 35 cities and counties to enable and support Fuse Executive Fellows tackling climate change, justice reform, affordable housing, and more. Victoria has also served as the Chief Resilience Officer and Deputy City Administrator for the City of Oakland, California, and has also been at the World Bank, the United Nations, and previously at FEMA, and worked alongside government officials to plan recovery efforts following major disasters. After Hurricane Katrina, she helped lead federal interagency efforts to develop new policies and programs that now guide disaster recovery in the U.S. And now back at FEMA, she's the highest-ranking Latina in FEMA's history. Victoria, we are so appreciative of your time today, and I'll hand it over to you for just some brief introductory comments before we jump into the conversation between you and Rachel and Melissa.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. It's wonderful to be with you all today, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of more informal, smaller group conversation. And what you all are doing, those of you who've really been drawn to this group, you're truly, and you know this already, you're truly at the forefront of what needs to happen. There's so much adaptation that needs to happen in these next decades to really address the climate crisis and help communities survive, that I really have deep gratitude for each of you in your day jobs, and for this network and community of practice that has come together. I think we're seeing this, I mean, every single week, just reading the headlines, right? We're experiencing already that what sometimes feels trite, like we know there's going to be increased severity and frequency of disasters, and we're actually just living it. And so I really do think that this group here and all of you are such key partners to what's in front of us now, but also what will continue to be in front of us for the decades to come. And I look forward to today's discussion, both to share what we're doing, but also I have a couple of folks from my team on as well in listening mode. I'm really keen to hear your own perspectives from your breakout groups and conversations at the end, because we are deeply committed to being good partners to you and others who are alongside us in this fight.
Victoria, is there anyone that you want to call on specifically to share anything, or should we move into the conversation?
I think we can jump into conversation.
All right. Let's just get Melissa back up here on the screen. Again, Victoria, we are so grateful to have you here. And thank you so much for those inspirational words. And I think I'm excited in particular to kind of dig into this intersection between climate adaptation and emergency management, which is so strong in our network. And I think that's really evident in how many people are here today to engage in that conversation. And speaking of engaging in our conversation, we are going to take a couple of audience questions. And so if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Victoria, please put it in the chat, and we'll take those a little bit later on. But first, we wanted to dive in with something that I know is top on all of our minds, and I'm sure is top on your mind as well, Victoria, which is systemic barriers to climate resilience investment. We know there are many, and we know that investment is not reaching those who are most affected by climate impacts with the least capacity to respond, Black, Brown, and low-income communities. We'd love to hear about how FEMA is addressing these systemic barriers to really deliver services to people who are disproportionately affected by climate change.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, that's really been a focus of this administration and of FEMA, as you all probably know. And I want to start with how we define resilience, because I think it also gets to the different aspects of systemic barriers. And we really look at resilience as the ability to prepare for anticipated hazards, adapt to those changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions at both the individual, community, and systems level. And I think this administration's focused on equity has really brought to the forefront the role of chronic stresses in society and how they exacerbate different types of vulnerability for different communities, different people, depending on identity, history, place, all of these different things. And so when we look at all that is entailed in resilience, there are a lot of different types of barriers depending on what you're looking at. And so specifically, I'll speak to some of the things we're doing at FEMA to really both better understand the barriers that communities face for investing in climate resilience and then dismantle them. There's a lot of things that as programs we have in our authority to do. Policies, government rights, regulations, they take a long time to get through, but again, it's in the hand of the executive branch. And so one of the things that we've been doing very systematically with our programs, both those that are risk reduction, hazard mitigation programs, as well as our emergency management programs, is looking at ways to prioritize underserved communities. And what this looks like is sometimes it's as straightforward as changing the points in a competitive grant. The nonprofit security grant program that we have in FEMA Resilience and at FEMA helps make all kinds of nonprofits and centers of worship, places of worship safer to man-made threats. And we increase the points for if you were benefiting an underserved community, you got more points. If you were a first-time applicant, you got more points, because we recognize that oftentimes there's a barrier to even wanting to play the game or being able to play the game of applying to federal grants. We took similar action in our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program and other programs, flood mitigation assistance, looking at how do we change the math behind competitive grants to really prioritize serving those communities that are most disadvantaged and most impacted by the impacts of climate change. And along those lines, I think that one of the things that I've really appreciated about the Biden-Harris administration is the focus around Justice 40. And what that means and for those of you who may not be familiar, Justice 40 is a call to make sure that many of our federal programs have at minimum 40% of the benefits going to disadvantaged communities. And why that matters from the point of view of reducing systemic barriers is that it provides accountability. Every year, I can now tell you, and my teams have to tell all of us and do the analysis of what's the percentage of underserved communities that benefited. And we're seeing it go up year over year, which is the right thing to have happen. But because there's that accountability where we're reporting on, yes, we achieved the target., no, we didn't achieve the target. 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 We didn't a it's allowing us to have those deeper dive conversations. And then those deeper dive conversations identify other systemic barriers, ones that sometimes are beyond our capability as the executive branch to address. And I'll give you one example here that's particularly relevant to, I think, this group, with our flood mitigation assistance program, which has been used in many communities to elevate homes that are in floodplains. You can also do community-based projects that reduce flood risk. There's a lot of different ways to use it. It's easiest to use to elevate homes. And so a lot of jurisdictions will have a list of homes with repetitive flood loss that need elevating, but with a bit more capacity, more holistic solutions can be designed. But where there's a systemic challenge is that the flood mitigation assistance program primarily is supposed to benefit those communities who participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Keep peeling the onion back. If you've participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, or if you have flood insurance, Congress hasn't yet passed the affordability framework that we've been urging them to pass. And so there's a systemic issue there, right? If you can afford flood insurance, great. It's way easier for you to take advantage of this program. And so we're also, by the focus on Justice 40 and equity, seeing where there's systemic barriers that we can't solve alone and that need congressional action, that just being one of the interplay between NFIP and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. And so that's been really helpful to better understand some of the barriers that that exist and that we can address. Some of the other barriers, and so those are kind of program and legislative ones. We are also looking at complexity is also a systemic barrier, with lower income, lower capacity communities having more difficulty navigating the complexity of federal programs. And your more well-resourced communities, they can hire consultants, they can have their folks on standby, they can have a grants management staff. That's not true for a lot of the most underserved communities. And so we have been through our various programs, trying to provide more technical assistance for navigating that, looking at ways to make the application process itself less complex. Relatedly, before I even joined the administration, I've been speaking with people about the challenges posed by benefit cost analysis, which is required for many of our programs. And a heavy economic analysis can be expensive, it can be complicated, and there was a lot of different systemic challenges with it that were being identified. And so one of the changes we made my first year back at FEMA was that if you're an underserved community, we would do the BCA for you. And we would just help you do that. So it was not a barrier to entry, because that was one of the things that was so unfortunate as a systemic barrier, was that you couldn't even apply if you hadn't done a BCA. Whether or not you had a good project, we didn't even get to that point of the conversation, because it was a binary yes or no, this exists, and it became a real systemic challenge to seeing more climate resilience projects, risk reduction projects from underserved communities. And along those same lines, we found through the data that really great adaptation and climate resilience projects weren't making their way through because of technical things like a discount rate, or how nature-based solutions were valued in the BCA. And so there's been a lot of, in identifying and unpacking the barriers that exist, we've been able to make a lot of progress. This past year changed the the discount rate for both our BRIC and FMA programs. We expect to see that continue the same this coming year and expand to other programs. But that's all because of that real big focus on, to your question, trying to really understand the barriers. And the last thing I would say here is, I feel like we are trying to do as much as we can to address the barriers that are in our control to address. There's some that we can't address as the federal government. They require true partnership with others. And a lot of that gets to the participation gap that we're seeing. Despite reducing barriers, we're still not seeing as many disadvantaged communities able to apply. The project pipeline needs to be there. We have trillions of dollars coming in through IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, but accessing those dollars means that you have projects in the ready. You have done community engagement, you've done a process, you know your risks, you have coalitions, you have partnerships, you have all these things that have resulted in multi-benefit projects that are going to be phenomenal, that probably have some engineering and cost estimates behind them. And that takes a lot of effort. So even though we can reduce barriers to accessing programs, the reducing the participation gap also has deep systemic roots and can, I think, only be accomplished through really comprehensive partnerships and supporting the communities that are most at risk with that whole process of and journey of holistically looking at risk, understanding what they need to do to adapt, and then being able to start to pull the project designs and initiatives together so that they're ready to apply for the government programs and other financing and resources. So we're trying to lower the barriers, but it's the broader partnership that is so vital to actually moving the needle.
Thank you, Victoria. And I do have a follow-up question about partnerships. But before that, I just want to remind folks, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and Rachel will grab them next. So I would love to hear a little bit about how FEMA is collaborating with partners and existing networks of emergency and climate adaptation professionals across the country. How are you developing and carrying out national policies that impact the natural and built environment, and what opportunities might there be in the future for us to build on these points of collaboration?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So there's a number of ways, and so when it comes to the resilience and adaptation space in general, one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is that we have been working on national resilience guidance. And for those of you in the emergency management space who may be on this call, you know that one of the responsibilities we have as FEMA is to be the stewards of the national preparedness system, which has planning frameworks that are supposed to be for the whole community. But if you've read them, it's very Fed-centric. And so we're trying to change that a little bit. But we also have recognized through dialogue with many stakeholders that part of the missing element in the emergency management space and in the nation writ large is clear kind of roles and responsibilities for how we go about the business of building more resilient communities and nation. And so what we've been doing, and we had a really great listening session actually with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, you all, back in 2023 or earlier this spring, to talk about the national resilience guidance. And so we've been doing a lot of stakeholder engagement. We had multiple listening sessions with over 600 folks from across different communities to really get to that question of how do we better collaborate and coordinate and in the resilience space. And so to your question, one of the things we're trying to do, we have some traditional partners. And some of those are traditional emergency management partners, traditional floodplain manager partners, traditional state hazard mitigation officers. On the Homeland Security side, fusion centers, there's a whole range of traditional partners that FEMA and Resilience is always working with. And we recognize that there's so many other partners who are key to actually helping our nation and communities with all the adaptation work that's required, that we've been very thoughtfully engaged in trying to expand who our partners are and how we're engaging in dialogue. This past year, over the last year, we also even did like a restructuring of resilience to better serve the purpose of our organization, and brought in list partners from the Black Resilience Network to the Sustainability Development Directors Network, like a whole range of partners that may not be typically considered like FEMA's normal partners, but that we recognized were really key. And so that's part of what we're continuing to try and do. And many of you may know Brad Dean. He's on the phone today. He used to run our Resilient Nation Partnership Network. Many of you may have joined some of those calls. But we're really investing in that partnership capability for the reasons I mentioned before. We can't do that. FEMA can't do this alone. The federal government can't do this alone. It's only through really productive partnerships that we're going to harness the expertise, the resources, the capacity of each of us to really accelerate the resilience building and adaptation that's needed.
Thanks so much, Victoria. And, I want to shift gears for a minute. First of all, I so appreciate that addressing systemic barriers is not a federal government only, project, and all of the rich ways that FEMA is already engaging partners across sectors. And then this kind of call and invitation for us to work together, and hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll also have a chance to identify some concrete ways that we can do that and really bring this work forward. But I think a lot of folks on the call today, they're on the ground and they're in it and they're, addressing climate impacts really tangibly all the time. And one thing that's coming up in some of the comments that we're hearing in the chat is specifically around public health and health impacts of climate change, and in particular heat. And so I wanted to kind of pose this question to you. What do you see as the opportunities for FEMA to work together, both with local emergency management folks, local health department folks, and perhaps even CDC and other federal folks who are working at the intersection of climate and health, whether it's a particular focus on heat health or other health impacts of climate change? We'd love to hear kind of the FEMA perspective on that need as well as the opportunities in that space.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with saying, or talking about kind of the chronic stresses that I mentioned at the top, right? Is that I think COVID showed many emergency managers firsthand, gave them that firsthand experience of just really seeing how chronic stresses and social determinants of health have an interplay with the ability of people to survive and thrive when something's happening. And so I think many people at FEMA have taken that. They now have lived it. There's a lot more people with lived experience now in emergency management, I think due to COVID and working in disadvantaged communities. And so when it comes to health in particular, I think there's a number of ways. I think as we look at the interplay of chronic stresses with vulnerability, many of those have to do with the social determinants of health. When we look at even tackling specific hazards, like you mentioned, heat, extreme temperatures, there's a huge health interplay as we think about community resilience. And we're seeing a lot, as many of you on the call may be in jurisdictions that have been looking at resilience hubs and looking at like, where should we try and make sure that we're designing projects or investing in the community in a way that really delivers multiple benefits. And so is it a community health clinic that has also got the microgrid that also does something else and is able to withstand any kind of event? And so it's that type of thinking that we're trying to, and those types of transformative projects that address more than physical infrastructure, but that are also very much related to the health and well-being of people on a regular basis, that we're trying to encourage through a lot of our grants and programs and guidance that are coming out to be supportive. And so I do think there's the health climate piece is absolutely interrelated, and it's exciting to see. I think the extreme heat conversation and extreme temperatures conversation has also really shifted and evolved has started to evolve thinking in emergency management and also on where the solution sets are. Like our programs, like we've talked about many times, are used to like elevate homes or take things out of floodways or seismically retrofit. And so we're trying to include now in all of our preparedness materials that weatherization is also part of the front line on extreme temperatures, and it'll reduce your pocketbook and include more guidance on extreme heat and how you tackle things. And so I think that health piece will continue to be really important. And even in the national resilience guidance that I mentioned, that came out very loud and clear in dialogue with various folks, the importance of really articulating the role and the intersection of health with resilience and making sure that that's that we're all keeping that front and center.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, thinking about all of those chronic stresses, how they add up, but I love the framing that you brought, which is looking at multiple benefits projects, right? There's so much opportunity in that, and really keeping that framing and teaching people how to articulate things through that frame, both so that projects can get through and get funded, but also that we have more projects coming down the pipeline that have that framing and really can address multiple benefits in that.
And I'll add one example, just to your point. Like I think those are the types of projects I always get excited about when I see that we've done or funded or coming in the pipeline, are those projects that deliver multiple benefits. And it's actually, I think this is one of the things I've appreciated about how we're seeing communities kind of shift their thinking on projects. And even at FEMA, like one of the things I've been stressing is we don't have the resources or time for single peril projects. Like if it's only addressing one hazard, it's probably not a good project because there's probably other things that that community is dealing with. And so earlier, a couple months ago, I got to be in San Francisco and I visited one of our hazard mitigation grant program funded projects in the Castro. It was a health center, and it was a seismic retrofit that we started with and helping them with that because it was such a critical health facility. But then there was also some energy upgrades, and there was also like a whole host of other things. And so it was nice to be able to make sure that this like critical public health facility was going to, that they were able to also improve kind of like fire safety. And so it was all kinds of different things that went into the project all at once to make sure that this essential health facility was able to keep going for people when they needed it.
Great. There's one more audience question that I want to get to before we kind of wrap up with a final piece. And we had a question come in around climate migration, managed retreat, and community-based relocation. Folks would love to know how FEMA is thinking about this, and especially thinking about the intersection between climate migration as an adaptation strategy, as well as the pressures that we're seeing from the insurance industry in light of recent disasters.
Yeah, so the way that we see, and I see kind of community-driven relocation or climate migration in terms of the spectrum of adaptation strategies, is that it's certainly one of the most, if you look at a spectrum of like minor change to major change in order to adapt, it's on the major, it's clearly on the major change end of that spectrum, right? And so largely because leaving your community or shifting your community or deciding that those are all very existential questions for communities. And so it is definitely on the more drastic end of the adaptation measures spectrum. That said, we're seeing a lot of Alaskan Native villages who are dealing with all kinds of like permafrost and coastal erosion issues, folks in the South, like a lot of different communities are starting to have that conversation and have been having that conversation. And we're seeing more communities actually trying to take action in that direction. And so where we, as a FEMA has been a lead coordinator and convener of the federal family in the response and recovery space for decades, and we're really trying to step into that role more effectively in the resilience space based on feedback we've been hearing from so many people. And so when it comes to this topic in particular, I have the pleasure of co-leading a working group along with DOI, Department of Interior, on community-driven relocation. And one of the things that we're aiming to do there, we've been doing a lot of listening sessions. There's a lot of money that there's some money that came through the bipartisan infrastructure law for USDA and DOI to support communities with community-driven relocation, is getting back to that, the first question about making things simpler. Like if you as a community have actually taken the decision that you want to move as an adaptation strategy, the fragmented patchwork quilt of federal programs should not be the barrier. And so we are working on looking at how we knit those things together. What's the optimum way we could knit federal programs together to support communities who want to take that adaptation strategy as the one that they've selected. And through that, we hope to also find where are those holes that we can't patch in that quilt, where we need congressional action in order to make it easier for communities to make a big move if that's what they choose. I think we're also seeing micro-migration as a new adaptation strategy too. I think New York City, New York State, I'm not very read into the details, but from what I understand, we're seeing more of like, my neighborhood keeps getting flooded. I'm tired of dealing with this. I love where I live. I'm going to move 2 blocks in. And that's a different adaptation challenge. It's like micro migration, but it also then links to affordable housing and housing availability and how to keep if you move 3 blocks in, is that a short-term adaptation strategy, or has the place you lived taken sufficient action that that you will be good to go for decades to come? And so I think we're certainly trying as an agency and as a federal family, trying to make sure that we're understanding how to be as supportive as we can to communities that seek to do that and people who seek to do that. I don't see us ever being directive. Sometimes we get asked like, should there be places you can't build? And certainly there's like some laws that with some rules are related to that, but I don't see, it's a very community driven approach is what we support.
Thank you. You'll continue to think about the pressures of sea level rise maybe alongside inland flooding. We do have a final question here about the advances that FEMA has made to modernize flood maps and insurance, if there are other plans to address climate change.
Great. So we are looking at building resilience in an all hazards approach. And so flooding is certainly one of the most frequent and costly hazards. And we've been working with many of our partners to mitigate other climate related threats as well, heat, wildfire, earthquakes, in addition to flooding. And so our flood maps are one of the tools in that toolbox. And we have been developing other tools as well. We've got the National Risk Index, which is covers multiple hazards. For those of you who may be more involved in like local land use planning and urban planning, the climate resilience and risk portal Climber came out earlier this year with Argonne that provides downscaled climate data at, I think, a 14-kilometer level or less. And so much more granular, which is helpful. It also includes the resilience analysis planning tool. We've got a codes initiative. So there's a lot of different tools that are coming out to really help with addressing different types of risk. The FEMA, the flood maps, from a regulatory perspective, and again, this ties to NFIP and insurance, are required to look at historic risk. And so that's what those flood maps do. But at the same time, recognizing and with a thrust on future conditions and being prepared for what's to come, we're also working on developing non-regulatory tools so that we can help convey risk better. And the future conditions work is not regulatory, because as soon as you make it regulatory, there's also financial implications and there's other implications. And until we address some of the affordability issues with insurance and other things, you end up in this loop that could actually be hurtful to some communities. But we want to make sure that that folks have information that is easy to use to do risk-informed planning, risk-informed adaptation, and that we're making progress on that front.
Thanks for asking or answering. I know that can be a sticky question, but it's one that is really constantly on the mind of our members. And I think, something that we've been pushing hard for and understand that not all changes will be able to come from inside the agency, but is something that we hope we can help the agency move forward on in the ways that make sense. Yeah,
and absolutely, and I think that where feedback is always really helpful is all these tools get developed, right? Even with FEMA is trying to transform the National Flood Insurance Program to allow us to better look at the effects of climate change. Part of the way they're doing that is like with trying to better depict risk, not just like the line in the sand, you're in or you're out of a risky area, but like what are the other ways to really show risk that doesn't make you feel like I'm safe because I'm on the other side of the line. Like that's not really how flooding works. And so to the extent you all have feedback as practitioners, something is useful or not useful, complicated or not complicated. Like I know part of what we've been exploring too is local data is usually the best data and how to upload that into other things. And so I think that conversation as we all work together to help people do risk-informed planning and risk-informed adaptation investments will be one area of continued value for us and hearing from you.
Absolutely. Thanks for that invitation. We don't want to keep you, Victoria. We're so extremely grateful for your time. I want to note that we have many, many, many questions that came in through the chat, but luckily we have a really strong representation from FEMA here in our ASAP network. And so what we'll do is we'll compile those questions, and if there are other folks from FEMA who can help us start to find some answers to them, we will do that. And so I just want to make sure that folks on the line know that your questions will not be forgotten. They may not get answered right away, and probably not by Victoria, but certainly will be the basis for some continued conversation inside the network.
Thank you so much, Rachel,
Yeah.
and everyone for having me today. And I saw in the chat we're happy to do a session at another point all on community disaster resilience zones. We just announced them yesterday. And it's a really exciting opportunity for driving prioritization and partnership that we think will be really accelerative to adaptation and resilience. And so if that's of interest to this group, we are happy to do a deep dive on the opportunities of CEDAR's community disaster resilience zones in the near future too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Victoria. We're so grateful for your time and for really giving us this look inside your work and the work of the agency. And we hope that we'll have a chance to have you back again soon.
It'll be my pleasure. You take care. Have a great rest of your conversation.
Thanks so much. Okay. Again, just want to emphasize that we have noted all of your questions, and we will really find a way that they can live on and that we can draw on the expertise of the rest of the FEMA staff who are part of the ASAP network to help us try to get some answers. And that this probably will not be our last FEMA-focused conversation. So let us know what you'd like to do next with that. And in the meantime, what we're going to do for the rest of our time, well, for most of the rest of our time together, the next about 10, 12 minutes, is have a chance to go into small groups for discussion and reflection on the conversation with Victoria. So I think Eliza is going to put a couple of prompting questions in the chat. Feel free to use these to the extent that they're helpful for driving conversation in your small group. And if you want to talk about other things, obviously feel free to do that. As I mentioned, we'll be in these groups for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will come back together for some closing words, upcoming opportunities, so I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the hour. Eliza, are we ready with breakout rooms?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and open them, and you all should just automatically be put in there. It's gonna be about 3 to 4 folks in each room. So I will open them.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and Anna to close us out.
Thanks, everyone. I think this has been a super productive and interesting conversation overall with Victoria, and then certainly in our breakout room we had a really interesting follow-up discussion. So appreciate everybody sticking around to the end. We just had a couple notes to share about upcoming meetings. So the next policy practice group meeting is on October 6th. We're going to have Andrea Weber and some colleagues join us to talk about adaptation resilience policy that's being implemented in Virginia and North Carolina. And we also always welcome everyone to join us on Slack, and we'll be sharing policy updates that we sometimes do during the meeting through Slack, since we didn't have time to do them today. So if anyone else has policy updates that you want to share, please feel free to add them there as well. And pass it over to Melissa for a couple network updates.
Thank you. Yeah, just quickly to say that our Networks of Networks meeting is going to be on Lucky Friday, October the 13th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have Kil Roberts, who is a Senior Program Officer from ICLEI USA, speaking to us about their network. And that Eliza put in the chat again ways to join both of these groups. So we hope to see you again.
And I want to flag two things. There are 2 ways for ASAP members to get involved in the 2024 National Adaptation Forum. You can become a special session organizer, or these are not mutually exclusive, you can submit a session proposal or a presentation abstract. So Eliza is going to put the links to those 2 opportunities in the chat. I want to emphasize that, as Melissa explained, Network of Networks is an open ASAP affiliated group. Anyone is always welcome to come to Network of Networks meetings. And the Policy Practice Group, anyone is also invited to join Policy Practice Group meeting for their first time. And then after your first meeting, we invite you and ask you to sign up and become an ASAP member as you come into your second meeting. And so if that's you, we are going to put the Join Us link in the chat. And regardless of which group you plan to join again next, really highly encourage you to join ASAP as a member if you have not done so already. thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to seeing you at another meeting. And the final link that we'll put in there is to our ASAP calendar. So you can know what other awesome, exciting peer learning group meetings are coming up in addition to Network of Networks and Policy Practice.